The storm came in sideways. Rain slammed against Eli Mercer's windshield as though the sky had decided to pelt him with handfuls of gravel instead of water. Wipers fought to keep up, the blades squealing with each desperate sweep. Somewhere beyond the rain-slick road, swallowed by shadows and ivy, stood Ashwood Manor. He'd only seen it once before, in a grainy email attachment from the property owner. The photograph had been washed in sepia tones, and the house's windows looked like hollow eyes. The message was simple: I need full interior and exterior photos by morning. Payment upon completion, midnight access, key under the third planter. Eli thought it was weird, but money was money, and the rate was too good to pass up. He slowed the car, headlights washing over a rusted iron gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. A sign hung crooked from one chain: Ashwood Manor, private property. It should have read, Abandon Hope, but maybe that would have been too on the nose. The gate wasn't locked. It gave way with a shriek that carried far into the night, the kind of sound that makes your spine flinch. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as Eli drove up the winding driveway, tree branches clawing at the car like they wanted him to turn back. When the manor finally appeared, it seemed to grow out of the ground rather than sit upon it, a hulking, three-story shadow with a steep roof and too many windows. Half the shutters hung loose, swaying just enough to tap against the walls. Eli stepped out of the car into the rain. The wind tugged at his hood as he searched for the third planter. Sure enough, there it was, chipped, moss-covered, and heavy with soil. Underneath it lay a long, blackened key, cold as ice in his hand. Inside the house, the air was thick, stale, and damp, like someone had locked it up decades ago and only now let it breathe. His flashlight beam cut across peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceilings. Dust hung in the air, floating like tiny motes of ash. The front door closed behind him with an unsettling click. He turned. The door was solid, the lock untouched. Still, something in him tightened. Room by room, he began setting up his tripod, camera, and lights. The job was straightforward. Get wide shots, then detail shots, then upload an invoice. But every time he moved into a new space, he could swear the floor plan had changed. The hallway leading to the dining room didn't lead to the dining room anymore. Instead, it opened into a narrow corridor lined with portraits. Faces stared back at him, men and women in formal clothes, painted in rich oil colors. None of them smiled. His beam caught a portrait at the end of the hall. A tall man with an impossibly long neck, wearing a black suit that seemed to fade into the shadows. The plaque beneath read, Erasmus Ashwood, 1843 to 1891. Eli stepped closer to focus his shot. The camera's display flickered once, then again. Through the lens, the man's painted eyes shifted. Not by much, just enough for Eli to know they were now looking directly at him. The sound came next, a whisper, low and curling like smoke. At first, he thought it was the wind in the vents. But no, it was coming from behind the painting. He took a single step back. The whisper grew louder. Then the portrait leaned forward. Eli stumbled back, his boot scuffing the dusty floorboards. The portrait shouldn't have been able to move, but there it was, the top edge leaning forward an inch. The painted figure's pale face closer now, as if it were trying to step into the hallway. The whisper had grown into something wetter, a hiss tangled with syllables he couldn't quite make out. Eli forced a nervous laugh. Right, drafty old house, portrait settling, totally normal. His laugh bounced down the corridor and came back distorted, too slow, stretched, like someone else was mocking him. The light rig flickered, the corridor darkened. For a moment, he considered packing up and telling the mysterious client that Ashwood Manor was photographically incooperative. But his bank account flashed in his mind like a neon sign, $127.48. He edged around the portrait, keeping his flashlight fixed on it until he was several steps past. The whisper faded behind him, replaced by another sound, creaking floorboards, in step with his own. He turned fast. Nothing, just the dark corridor and a row of unsmiling faces. He walked faster, pushing through a doorway at the end and froze. This wasn't the dining room, or the library, or any room he'd seen on the floor plan. It was circular, walls lined with high bookshelves that stretched all the way to the domed ceiling. A spiral staircase hugged the curve of the wall, vanishing into shadow above. Dust blanketed the room so thickly it muted the sound of his boots. But there was something wrong. The books weren't titled, every spine was blank. He pulled one out. It was heavier than it should have been, the leather binding cool to the touch. He opened it, and his stomach flipped. The pages weren't paper. They were mirrors, hundreds of thin, reflective leaves, each one catching his flashlight beam and bouncing it in strange, impossible angles. In one of them, his reflection moved a half-second too slow. He slammed the book shut. From somewhere above, a voice, soft, feminine, and very close said, "You're early." Eli looked up toward the staircase. A figure leaned over the railing 2 floors above. She was dressed in a sweeping gown the color of candle wax, hair pinned up with glittering silver combs. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the dark, and her smile was unsettling. Too wide, too knowing. "You weren't supposed to arrive until the others," she continued. "Others?" Eli asked, voice cracking despite his effort to sound calm. Her smile widened just a fraction more. "Oh yes," she said. "Midnight's only just begun." She vanished from the railing like someone had blown out a candle. A low boom echoed through the house, the sound of the front door locking itself again. The boom rolled through Ashwood Manor like distant thunder, rattling picture frames and sending a shiver through the floorboards beneath Eli's boots. He took a step toward the spiral staircase, but the instant his foot touched the first step, the entire house seemed to inhale. The air grew thick, warm, almost expectant, and then the lights from his rig died completely. Darkness pressed in from all sides. His flashlight flickered, caught on for a heartbeat, then went out. In the blackness, wood groaned. Not just in one spot, everywhere at once. A shifting, sliding sound, like furniture being dragged across a floor far above him, below him, around him. When his flashlight blinked back on, the circular library was gone. He now stood in what looked like a child's bedroom. A toy chest slouched in the corner, its paint chipped and faded. The wallpaper was patterned with faded blue balloons, though in some spots the balloons had been crudely scribbled over in black crayon. A rocking horse swayed gently in the corner, even though there was no draft. Eli muttered, "Okay, either I'm losing my mind, or this house is." The toy chest coughed. Eli froze. The lid creaked open just enough for a tiny voice to whisper, "You're not wearing the right shoes." He blinked at it. "What?" "They'll scuff the floors," the voice said, matter of fact, as though this were the most pressing problem in the world. Before he could answer, the lid snapped shut again, not with menace, but with a tidy thunk, like a butler closing a door. That was when Eli noticed the hallway outside the bedroom door. He was certain it hadn't been there before. The hallway stretched far longer than the house should have allowed. At the end, a faint light flickered, orange and warm, the kind of light you'd expect from a cozy fire. He followed it, the floorboards sighing beneath him. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon. Halfway down the hall, he passed another doorway and had to stop. Inside was a vast ballroom, chandeliers glittering overhead, every surface immaculate, except the walls were crawling. Not with insects, but with dozens of pale, translucent hands, reaching in and out of the plaster as if swimming through it. They weren't grabbing for him. In fact, they seemed to be adjusting the room, straightening paintings, dusting furniture, polishing the floor. One hand even gave him a polite little wave before sliding back into the wall. Eli's pulse was still hammering, but a strange thought wormed its way into his mind. What if they're not trying to hurt me? He continued toward the light at the end of the hall, where the faint sound of music, jaunty, almost cheerful, was starting to play. The hallway spilled Eli into a grand parlor, the kind you only ever saw in historical dramas or overproduced wedding venues. A massive fireplace glowed with that orange light he'd been chasing, flames licking lazily at blackened logs. The scent of cinnamon was stronger here, undercut by something else, something sweet, like frosting. The music was coming from a gramophone in the corner, its brass horn polished to a shine. The record spun at a slightly wrong speed, making the jaunty tune just off kilter enough to set his teeth on edge. He wasn't alone. Figures milled about the parlor in soft focus, as if he were seeing them through a thin veil of fog. Some were tall, others hunched. One was wearing what looked like a diving suit from the early 1900s. Another's head was nothing but a floating teacup, steam curling from the top. And in the middle of the room, the woman from the spiral staircase stood smiling at him like he'd finally arrived at her dinner party. "Ah," she said, "our photographer." Every head, human, not quite human, and crockery, turned toward him. Eli's hands tightened on his camera. "I was just supposed to take pictures of the house. No people, or whatever you are, not people, dear," said the woman, gliding forward without moving her feet. "Guests." The diving suit figure gave a muffled wave. The teacup head nodded, a small dribble of tea splashing onto its collar. One guest, a portly man in an old-fashioned velvet coat, stepped forward holding a plate. "Cake?" he offered cheerfully. The cake was a shade of purple Eli had never seen in nature. I'm good, Eli said automatically. The man looked mildly offended but shuffled back into the crowd. The woman clasped her hands. We gather every year on the anniversary of the unfortunate business. What business? Eli asked. She tilted her head in a way that was both coy and unnerving. The one you'll photograph, of course. The fire gave a sudden pop, and every guest froze mid-motion, forks hovering over plates, hands suspended mid-gesture, even the teacup head's steam halted mid-curl. Somewhere deep in the house, a grandfather clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. When it struck 12, the room came back to life in an instant. The woman's smile widened. Midnight, she said. Now the fun begins. The gramophone needle scratched. The jaunty tune warped into something faster, bouncier, almost like a dance hall number. The guests began to move in odd, jerky, enthusiastic ways. A few paired off and began waltzing, though not all in the same rhythm. Eli backed toward the doorway, his camera hanging loose in his grip. That was when he noticed the walls of the parlor, shifting outward. The room was expanding, stretching like taffy, making space for more guests who stepped in from impossible doorways. And every single one of them turned to look at him as they arrived. Eli had never been to a party where he was so obviously the only one not in on the joke. The parlor had tripled in size since he'd stepped inside. A balcony now circled the upper level, where ghostly figures leaned over the railing, tossing down confetti made of what looked like crumbling book pages. The music from the gramophone had found a frantic, happy tempo, and the guests swirled like they'd been waiting all year for this moment. Don't just stand there, boy, boomed a voice beside him. Eli turned to find a woman in a green Victorian gown, her head replaced by a floating lantern. The flame inside her glass skull flared brightly. It's the dance of the year. I don't dance, Eli said. She shook her flame. Oh, nonsense. One of her gloved hands, perfectly normal despite the lack of a head, grabbed his wrist and spun him into the crowd. He stumbled right into the diving suit guest, who caught him by the shoulders. The helmet's round glass face was fogged from the inside, but the figure gave a muffled laugh and began steering him in clumsy two-step movements. The music swelled, and suddenly the entire floor seemed to pulse in time with the beat, carrying them all in slow, rolling waves. Someone passed him a goblet filled with a drink that smelled like cinnamon, mint, and campfire smoke. He hesitated. It's rude to refuse, whispered the teacup head from behind him, steam curling over Eli's shoulder like an eager pet. He took a small sip. Warmth spread instantly through his chest, but not in a normal way. It was as if the warmth knew where his ribs were and was politely making itself at home. That's better, the teacup head said, patting his back with a porcelain hand. Somewhere across the room, the woman in the candlewax gown raised her voice above the music. Tonight, my friends, we honor the living among us. A cheer went up, high, low, guttural, and even metallic. Several guests clinked their drinks together, a few clinked their heads. Eli started to relax, just slightly, until he saw a cluster of guests in the far corner whispering and pointing at him. They weren't dancing, they were huddled around a tall, spindly man in a black coat with a neck far too long for his body. He recognized the face instantly. The portrait, and the portrait was smiling now. The tall man's eyes locked with Eli's. His grin widened as he whispered something to his little group, and one by one, they began making their way toward him, weaving through the dancers. The music kept playing, the lights kept glowing, but a cold bead of sweat ran down Eli's spine. Whatever was about to happen next, the rest of the party seemed very interested in seeing it. The dancers seemed to part on their own, as if someone had drawn an invisible line down the middle of the parlor. On the other side, Erasmus Ashwood strode forward, towering and elegant in his black coat, his long neck swaying slightly with each step like it belonged to a marionette. Up close, his grin wasn't menacing in the way Eli had expected. It was sharp, yes, but also strangely gleeful, like he'd been waiting all year to meet the photographer. Mr. Mercer, he said, his voice rich and resonant. Our guest of honor. How do you find my home? Eli swallowed. Confusing. Erasmus threw back his head and laughed, the kind of laugh that would have been terrifying if it didn't sound like someone had just told the best punchline in the world. Confusing. Perfect. He spun toward the crowd. You hear that, friends? Our guest is confused. Tradition upheld. A ripple of applause went through the room. Someone popped a balloon that smelled faintly of nutmeg. Eli blinked. Tradition? Yes, yes, Erasmus said, waving a bony hand. Each year, we bring in one living soul to photograph the festivities. We can't very well do it ourselves, light bends oddly through us, you understand. The lantern-headed woman nodded solemnly. But, why me? Eli asked. Oh, you were recommended, Erasmus said casually. By the toy chest. Eli glanced toward the hallway. The toy chest coughed at me. Yes, he does that when he's nervous, Erasmus said. Anyway, you've passed the preliminary tests, survived the shifting rooms, endured the polite haunting of the portraits, accepted a drink from the tea fellow. The teacup head gave a tiny bow. Which means, Erasmus continued, you are now eligible to photograph the grand finale. The grand finale of what? Eli asked. Erasmus grinned wider, somehow. The annual Ashwood Manor conga line. Eli blinked at him. You're kidding. The gramophone needle scratched, and suddenly a blaring, absurdly upbeat tune filled the parlor. Without hesitation, every guest, lantern head, teacup head, diving suit, balloon-popping imp, snapped into motion, forming a winding, stomping line that began to snake through the room. Erasmus clapped Eli on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. You'll want a wide shot for the start, then track us as we spiral up the stairs. And do mind the walls, they like to join in. Sure enough, pale hands were already emerging from the plaster, waving in time with the music. For the first time since arriving, Eli found himself laughing. It wasn't a scared laugh, either, more like the helpless kind you get when the absurdity of a situation finally breaks you. Erasmus took his place at the front of the line, neck swaying to the beat. Mr. Mercer, he called back, tonight, you're one of us. The music blared like some unholy mix of ballroom waltz and carnival parade, the gramophone horn somehow glowing with its own golden light. Eli's camera clicked as he stepped backward, framing Erasmus at the head of the conga line. The long-necked host stomped in rhythm, every guest behind him mimicking the move with varying degrees of grace. The diving suit guest moved like a slow tank, while the teacup head bobbed so enthusiastically that tea sloshed over the rim and splattered the floor. The line wove past the fireplace, under the balcony, and impossibly through a door that hadn't been there seconds ago. Eli followed, still taking pictures, and found himself in a kitchen the size of a basketball court. Pots and pans were dancing midair, flipping pancakes and juggling ladles. A rolling pin spun in lazy circles like a bored figure skater. One of the ghostly hands from the wall offered Eli a cupcake topped with purple frosting and something suspiciously sparkly. You must, the hand said, its voice like a polite whisper. He took it, bit into it, and immediately tasted cinnamon, mint, and some flavor he couldn't place, like a memory of laughing so hard your ribs hurt. The line moved on, climbing a sweeping staircase that curled up into the ceiling. The strange thing was, when they reached the top, they weren't upstairs, they were outside. Or sort of outside. The sky was a painted ceiling of swirling stars, and the ground was soft grass that smelled faintly of old books. Lanterns floated above them, bobbing gently in a non-existent breeze. Keep snapping, Erasmus called. We'll want this for the album. The conga line grew longer as more guests joined from nowhere. A headless juggler tossing flaming pins, a woman whose gown was made entirely of fluttering playing cards, a very serious-looking ghost dog wearing a monocle. Eli was laughing now, genuinely, ducking between dancers to get the best angles. Somewhere along the way, the tension in his shoulders had melted, replaced by a giddy sort of disbelief. When the line looped back into the manor, the music shifted into a triumphant, slightly off-key finale. Erasmus spun, his coat tails flaring, and the entire party erupted into applause. Splendid, he said, clapping his long fingers together. Another successful midnight in Ashwood Manor. The guests began drifting away, some through doors, others straight through the walls. The woman in the candlewax gown glided over to Eli. We'll see you next year, of course. Eli raised an eyebrow. Do I get a choice? She smiled that same unsettling, amused smile. Not in the slightest. The front door creaked open behind him, the first time it had done so all night. Outside, the storm had passed, and a pale dawn was creeping over the trees. Eli stepped out, the weight of his camera strap familiar against his neck. When he glanced back, Ashwood Manor was gone, replaced by an overgrown clearing and a rusted gate swinging gently in the morning breeze. He checked his camera. Every shot was perfect, crisp, colorful, and just the right amount of impossible. And every single photo had a little purple confetti in the corner. 3 days later, Eli sat in the corner booth of a quiet cafe, nursing a coffee and scrolling through the final edits on his laptop. He'd emailed the photos to the client that morning, though client still felt like too normal a word for whoever, or whatever, had hired him. He half expected no reply at all. Maybe the email would just vanish into the digital void, the way the house had. Instead, at exactly noon, his phone pinged with a new message. From Erasmus@ashwoodmanor.org. Subject: Payment and Notes. Eli's stomach dropped, then rose again in a weird little loop as he opened it. Mr. Mercer, magnificent work. The lighting on the balloon-popping imp is divine, and you managed to capture the ghost dog's monocle without lens flare, no easy feat. The annual conga shot is a masterpiece. The only note is that in frame 412, my neck looks slightly shorter than usual. Please adjust. Payment has been transferred to your account, along with a bonus. We look forward to seeing you next year. Warmest hauntings, Erasmus Ashwood, host and master of ceremonies. Eli frowned and checked his bank app. Sure enough, the money was there, far more than he'd been promised. But there was also a second deposit in the form of an unmarked envelope that had just appeared on the table beside his coffee. He hadn't seen anyone put it there. Inside was a single purple balloon. It bobbed into the air on its own, hovering in front of him. Then it popped with a gentle poof, releasing a faint smell of cinnamon and laughter. Eli sighed, grinning despite himself. Guess I'm booked next year. The balloon string curled into the shape of a little wave before vanishing into nothing. May your nights be weird and your laughs be loud. Don't leave me haunting this channel alone. Click like to keep the spirits chatty, and subscribe so you don't miss their next whisper.